this is something that I would really like to explore with all of you today. First of all, maybe a few words about myself. My name is Denis Salnikov. I am working as a Scrum Master for quite some time, since 2014. I'm currently based in Krakow, Poland, but have worked and lived in many places. I think the closest place to Graz where I have worked and lived is Berlin, probably. I'm not sure what's the distance from Graz to Berlin and from Graz to Krakow. I currently occupy several roles in several companies. So first of all, I work as a full-time employee in the startup unicorn in the product company called PandaDog, and I work there as a head of agile practices. I also lead some open and corporate trainings with my wonderful colleagues from co-actors. And from time to time, when such chances occur, I also do some consulting as a LS coach and org design consultant in my self-started company called Agile Expat. And the talk I will be delivering today, it won't be based on some overwhelming amount of theory, even though there will be some. It will be mostly based on the practical experience I had in quite some companies. Some of them you can see on the current slide. So before we deep dive into the process of self-designing teams, into the idea, into the reasoning behind why we can think of trying self-designing teams, I would like first to establish some foundation by discussing self-organizing teams and self-designing teams. What are those and what's the difference? And what I love about self-organizing teams is that in the Agile community, there are quite some topics which always cause hot discussions, especially, for example, between people who prefer different frameworks or different methods, especially between people who prefer, for example, Scrum framework or Kanban methods. And if I would have to highlight the only thing, or like one important thing that both Scrum and Kanban highlight, is the importance of self-organization. Because here, as you can see on the screen, on the excerpts from both the original Scrum Guide of 2010 and the so-called Blue Book of Kanban, or Essential Kanban Condensed, both of these approaches put a lot of emphasis on the importance of self-organization, what it means in fact, and that in both, whatever approach we choose, we need to either aim for having self-organized teams or for having people self-organize around the work which is being managed. And the roots of that, they spread quite far in the past. So back in the 1986, Dr. Takeuchi and Nanaka from Japan released a white paper called the New Product Development Game. I'm not sure whether you are familiar with that, but I hope you are, because this is the white paper which basically gave the origin to the term Scrum and to the ideas which lie in the foundation of the Scrum framework. What Takeuchi and Nanaka were trying to achieve back then, and like for me personally, this is a quite a long time ago. I personally wasn't even born back in 1986. They were visiting different companies in Japan, which by that moment was already one of the leading countries in the world's economy, despite all destruction that the Second World War brought to it, and interviewing people occupying different roles in those successful companies, trying to nail down some aspects of culture or of processes in those teams. So on that screenshot on the right from that exact white paper, you can see the 6 key elements of successful companies they were able to define, and one of them were self-organizing project teams, meaning that those are teams which operate more like a startup company, because they're operating in a kind of unpredictable environment, which we nowadays know as complex environment from the Canadian framework. And one of the key traits of those teams are that they take initiative and risk and develop an independent agenda over time. One adjustment which was made in the latest version of Scrum Guide is that they switched from term self-organizing team to self-managing, but it basically still means the same, that those are the teams who choose who, how, and what will work on, and how they will deliver the work needed to achieve sprint goal. For me personally, that was a despite changing only one word, that was a quite important change, because that allows me to introduce the Hackman authority model, which you might have probably heard of. This is a creation of a wonderful person, Richard Hackman, who was a professor of social and organizational psychology at Harvard University. And he has conducted a lot of researches and delivered a lot of wonderful models and ideas around topics as team performance, leadership effectiveness, design of self-managing teams, and so on and so forth. So in his original authority model, what was previously described in the Scrum guide as self-organizing teams was called self-managing teams. So I personally like the fact that they've changed this term, because it now bridges that idea closer to the ideas that Richard Hackman was propagating. What it also means is that now we can look at that model with more reliability and see what are the boundaries which stand beyond the self-managing teams. So here you can see that this is basically a matrix with 2 coordinates, and on the horizontal coordinate we have different levels of maturity of teams, and on the vertical coordinate we have different aspects of work which team either takes itself or delegates to management when depending on the level of its maturity. And so self-managing team is something that Scrum framework aims for. Self-managing people and people organizing into self-managing teams is also something that Kanban method aims for. But we can see here clearly that the next stage, which comes beyond the self-management, is self-design. And I was always eager to learn what it actually means in practice, what it would mean being applicable to companies. So from that model, we could see that self-designing teams are basically teams that design themselves and define their organizational context. If we take a step back and take a look at the original book, which introduced all those ideas, also by Richard Hackman, what he described there was that those are teams that have authority to modify the design of their team or aspects of their organizational context in which they operate, or both. So in fact, this is a minor change, but here it should say or instead of and. But what such kind of vague phrases as designing the team and defining its organizational context would mean in the real life practice? So if we would take, for example, the regular agile team operating in a company, the first part would mean that people in that team can, first of all, choose who is on the team, who is a member of the team. And also it means that people who are currently being outside of any team are able to choose which team to join. They can over time define and or adapt the required skill set they need to have in the team. For example, if they were previously working on their product and their product had only a web version, but now they've decided to introduce the mobile application, they will probably need to expand the skill set required in order to be a team able to deliver end-to-end. And what's also important, they should be able to decide whom to hire or whom to fire from the team. And this is also, by the way, very in line with what the Scrum suggests, because one of the points there is that developers are always accountable for holding each other accountable as professionals, meaning that when we are establishing a self-managing Scrum team, over time, we want them to develop the trait of judging their own performance, assessing the level of professionalism of everyone in the team, and in case something is going wrong, so for example, someone is continuously breaking the definition of done, they need to be able to raise this topic to someone and to get that person either put on some kind of probation or removed from the team. In most organizations, it happens kind of different way. In most organizations, that can usually happen only if the management sees such problem. When it comes to the organizational context, being a self-designing team means that, first of all, team can choose which part of the organization to be, or choose which business objectives to pursue or which feature to develop, meaning that basically team is not that dependent on the management's decision to move it here and there, but can come up with some initiative themselves. We can now talk about introducing self-design, so how all those high-level things would look in practice. And this part of the talk will be structured in the following way. So first, I will share with you the design of the self-design workshop, which could be run potentially at any company. I initially decided to put it here, not in the end, because I thought that in the end, it's better to put the reasoning behind self-design and why it is important. Then I will also share the strategies which could potentially give you an opportunity to introduce self-design or to try self-design in your company. And then we will come to the reasoning part. So when it comes to introducing self-design, very important thing you need to remember is you need to heavily rely on volunteering. And volunteering is one of the things which is unfortunately heavily underestimated in the management world. But basically, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Craig Barban and Buzz Body, because management feels that this can somehow undermine their ability to control what's going on. But for people in teams and for people in the organization, being able to not only follow the commands, but also volunteer for certain things, even beyond the boundaries of the team, is very empowering. So this is why when we are trying to introduce self-design and we want to actually hold the self-design workshop in our company, we need to start with the purpose of the change we're trying to do. So we need to educate people on the reason behind that change. And this should ideally come from the top management, because unless top management buys into this idea, this will probably die over time and won't deliver a sustainable result. And when talking to people, either ideally before holding the self-design workshop, there should be a clear clarification on such questions as why we are doing this, what's wrong with the way we are currently structured, and why we are trying to change this, why it is important from the business perspective, what we want to achieve with this change, what we hope to get by the end of this activity, and also clarify some concerns and answer questions. So later in my slides, you will see the examples of how it's happening in real life. But what happens next is establishing some guidelines and constraints, which are both the parts of the facilitation activity and the part of the organizational design activity. What do we mean here by guidelines and constraints? First of all, we need to be clear about what is the average size or ideal size of the team we're aiming for, so that people know that, for example, if they're about to come up with a team of 15 people, this is not something we want to accept, because we are aiming for smaller teams which have better communication. We need to highlight the skill set of people we would like to have in the team, being not only for example, different programming languages or different roles, but also their business expertise or understanding of certain components. So experience with certain components and subject domain expertise are the things that also matter. Why we want to put such constraints? Because ideally we want to come up with this set of teams where each team, or at least most of the teams, are able to deliver end-to-end, meaning that they will not have any external dependencies when it comes to getting stuff done and delivering their work in increment to the end user. And also, we need to avoid forming component teams. This is what these constraints are designed for, but also this will require some hands-on challenging and discussions during the self-design itself. The company can potentially also come up with different set of constraints or additional set of constraints, but it's also important not to make it too strict, otherwise there will be no self-design magic. So this is the part where the magic happens, and usually this takes quite some time, because we won't come up with the ideal solution in a single round. So we need to, when it comes to facilitation, if it's an online facilitation, we need to have we probably would like to use some tool for online collaboration, like Mural board we're using for this conference, or Miro board. And we would like to clearly establish some stations or frames where each team could land and which it could utilize for discussion. If it would be an offline setup, which in fact is much better for this kind of activity, it could be just flip charts put into different corners or different parts of a big space. Another important thing, because there will be quite some chaotic movement throughout this exercise, is to visualize those skills, which we were talking about previously. So that can be some kind of like a badge where people have their skills highlighted. There could be some kind of color coding, or if we're talking about online events, we could give people a homework to prepare some kind of avatar or profile of their own, which would contain information about their skills and domain expertise. Provide enough space, both physical and virtual, doesn't matter. And like the role of the facilitator here will be mostly about observing the dynamics which are going on, and understanding things that people got, understanding the people which might have confused people, and adapting them in the further rounds, because as it's clear from the slides, the last statement, there will be multiple rounds. So what usually happens on the fourth stage, where we review interim results and repeat step 3? We usually, together with the management and other people who are empowered to make final decision and consider the self-design exercise done, we need to pay attention to, first of all, how constraints have been followed about the size, about the skill set. So we need to check the teams which people came up with on their size and challenge them if they, for example, have approached the top constraint we've put there. For example, if we said that ideally teams should be 7 ± 2 people, if they created a team of 9 people, we need to clearly like ask them questions about why did they come up with such choice, what they expected to bring, what potential side effects of that they can see, and like just make them think about it another time. Also, the thing which is kind of sounds contradictional even to me, but I've experienced some dynamics over time in self-design teams. It's important to pay attention to the personality types we have in the team, and I'm not talking about very like deep and overcomplicated typologies like DISC or like Myers-Briggs, etc. I'm talking here more about whether we have someone who could potentially become a unofficial leader of that team, or multiple people who could step into the leader's shoes, whether we have not too many introverts in that team, because that can lead to a low energy level in the team, and these kind of things. Crucial gaps in the skill set, obviously, because we want teams to be able to deliver value end-to-end. This means that both from the skill set perspective and from the domain expertise perspective, they need to have some minimum viable set of expertise. And openness towards multi-learning. This is a very important topic if we are optimizing the organization for agility or for adaptiveness. We want people to be ready to learn new things, meaning that they should be ready to acquire new skills and become specialized in them as well. This is not what people typically call T-shaped, because T-shaped is usually about having a single deep specialization and some other narrow specializations. It's about developing like secondary specialization, tertiary specialization, etc. And usually, like when that round of challenging the teams has been done, we want to go for another 2 or 3 rounds before we actually come up with the ideal teams we are ready to let go to deliver work. So yeah, these are the 4 steps of the workshop. Now we can get to the probably one of the most interesting parts without which it will be completely useless. So when you could potentially introduce such kind of a workshop or such kind of an activity in your company. First obvious situation is some critical urgency. And I'm not talking here about like just some average bug or some average incidents happening in production, because if it's already happened, it's too late. I'm talking about more serious and big urgencies, like, for example, new regulatory requirements or new product hypothesis you want to invest in, or for example, some adjustment you need to make. Probably one of the examples most known to the wider audience is the introduction of GDPR. So when the GDPR got introduced, many companies had to significantly adjust how they work with the data of their customers, how they store it, how they collect this data, and that required a lot of changes in the backend. For people who are working in the fintech industry, like I myself had, such change was introduction of PSD2 regulation, which also put some significant constraints on the activities of financial companies. So this can be an opportunity for you to introduce self-design, but what's the problem here? And why is it important? Most of you are probably familiar with the book by Daniel H. Pink, Drive, which focuses on the topic of extrinsic and intrinsic motivation and what drives people in their work. And in his book, what I would like to especially highlight, he focuses on the point that when it comes to creative work, to intellectual work, intrinsic motivation always overcomes the extrinsic motivation. And by extrinsic motivation, we mean such things as the new title, better compensation, I don't know, stock options, etc. Those things give some boost to performance, but when it comes to intellectual work, that usually is a very short-lived boost. When it comes to intrinsic motivation, Mr. Pink highlights three key domains, being autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And those are things which are, if they are perfectly combined, can deliver the best results for the company and also for the individuals in terms of engagement, in terms of the results they deliver, in terms of their retention of the workforce. There will be some data in my talk on that later. So what often happens when such urgencies arise in the real companies? So somebody just comes, being the manager, like in the famous or infamous manager from the Dilbert comics, and makes some decision that, for example, I don't know, Johan, Otto, and Marie, they go into a new team and they now address that new big important thing. And like I experienced that myself. What that means if we try to map this kind of approach on the Daniel Pink's model. First of all, not having an ability to choose whom to work with and whether they would like or not like to leave their current team, and also having no ability to challenge or disagree with that decision, people completely lose the sense of autonomy. And like this is very important for grown-ups. Of course, when you come to work, you definitely don't expect to be completely free to decide what to do and when. But at the same time, you don't want to feel like a grown-up who is being told by his mother, like whom to date or which car to drive. This is not the best feeling for a grown-up. Another thing is purpose. So when people are left without the choice what to work on, or when they're asked to switch from their job they are currently performing, if they've been enjoying that work, that also undermines their purpose, their sense of purpose a lot. And what it leaves us with is only mastery. I'm not saying that this is something that will occur in 10 situations out of 10, but what I've seen in my experience is that quite often leaving people out of mastery and out of autonomy and purpose makes them hypercompensate with the mastery. And usually when we talk about software development, we're talking about technical mastery. So first of all, people may start coming up with overcomplicated solutions. I usually call it a CV-driven design or like resume-driven design, when people are introducing some fancy technologies or some fancy tooling only to put it later on their CV and make them stand out on the market. People may come up with solutions which are not serving the purpose, the original purpose, because they are not buying into this purpose. And also over time, that motivation goes down a lot. You can try to survive on the mastery motivation for a quarter, maybe for 2 quarters, but sooner or later, this will evaporate and you will decide to leave the company, leading to a higher attrition in the company. What managers are usually trying to do in such cases, they try to sweeten the pill and I've seen it myself. So one of the examples I usually bring up in such situations when talking about such management decisions and about the opportunity for self-design is the case I've experienced in one of the German fintech startups who had a quite successful and performing Scrum teams working on the same backlog and delivering a new product, which was currently looking for a product market fit. And when suddenly the PSD2 regulation requirements came to our table, what management did was just joining yet another sprint review of the team, waiting for the sprint review to end and saying that, thank you for your work. And by the way, you from tomorrow on, you are leaving your teams and you'll start working on saving our assets from PSD2. Like, first of all, talking about consequences, the PSD2 regulation requirement was delivered on time, but 2 months later than the original projected timeline. Second of all, after it got delivered, all those people who were chosen for that team left the company, leaving us with a huge headache on how to get their positions backfilled. What I also usually try to make people think about when they try to sweeten the pill is to remember that all problems they are currently facing are coming from the solutions they applied yesterday. This is one of the systems thinking laws. And if you want to deep dive into the topic of systems thinking, I suggest you to check out this book, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. It's a very great book, which focuses on the learning organizations. And learning organization is kind of the foundation for actually being an adaptive agile organization. So, okay, critical urgency, we've talked about that. Most usually when you are dealing with a critical urgency, like you will need to come up with 1 or 2 teams, not more. And this is not the only case which can be relevant to their company. Another very often case is the organizational growth, when the company is getting bigger or when teams in the company are getting bigger and we need to break them down. So once again, how it often gets done in the organizations, managers just make a decision to change the project per person. And for them, this is an easy decision, but for a person, it can mean a lot. Why? We already discussed it here. Of course, there is still a chance that a person will find some purpose and mastery, but two of 3 are better than 1 of 3, but we ideally aiming for 3 of 3, right? So how we're approaching that, for example, in PandaDoc, the company I currently work for. These are the screenshots of the real Miro board, which we were using during one of the self-design sessions. And what you can see here on the left is first of all, this whole reasoning we were trying to provide when inviting people to that session. So we were trying to show them the current composition of our domain in PandaDoc, we call it tracks, but in some organization can be called a value stream, a tribe, or something else. In PandaDoc, it's called track. And here on the left, you can see on the top, the overall track composition, and on the bottom, those constraints which the managers were suggesting for the teams. So as you can see here as well, on the left, we first of all tried to collect all the concerns people had about this change and about the suggested structure, and we spent quite some time answering those constraints and clarifying them. Of course, you will never be able to clarify all of the concerns, but at least you need to try and to invest some time into that, because people will at least see that they're being listened to. Some of them will get answers to the questions they are having in their minds. Maybe some of them will get insights that will also help them to persuade other people in the company or in the team. And as you can see also here, back then we initially suggested 2 possible options of how the new teams would look like, and we asked, after delivering all this clarification, answering concerns, we asked people to vote for the setup they would prefer. So in the end, we chose the setup, and we then moved to the self-design part. On the right, you can see already the results. This is not results from the same session. These are results from the session which happened 3 months later, when we had to break down the 2 teams we already had by then into three teams, because we hired more people. Those people got onboarded. Those people have successfully either already passed the probation period or been approaching the successful ending of probation period. And we were conducting the self-design again to decide how the 3rd team will look like. Yeah. And the last but not the least, the option which is better to avoid, but the option which sometimes may come to your door, is the organizational design change. That's something that's usually called agile transformation or company transformation. What I mean by that is that like if you're experiencing the situation where your company suddenly decides that it needs to change the way it works and needs to adapt its organizational structure, you can use the self-design here as well. Once again, how it's usually done, management comes from some class, from some conference, from some, I don't know, coaching session, and they suddenly tell, from tomorrow on, we'll be switching to fast-moving teams, and we will become agile as everyone, and that will allow us to deliver better results. This Dilbert comics, in my opinion, summarizes quite well how people usually feel in these situations, being people in the teams. What they feel is that they are not being asked. But what if I told you if you can actually self-design the whole company, or at least its bigger part? This is where we could once again refer to Mr. Hackman and to his works. And besides the Hackman authority model here, there is another model he left as a huge source of interesting ideas for the industry, the Hackman's model for team effectiveness. So what we see here is that we first of all need to have real team. We need to have a compelling direction that is similar to Daniel Pink's purpose. And what we also need to have is enabling structure, meaning that the company is structured in a way which enables those teams to pursue that compelling direction in a efficient way and takes away any waste in the structure or in process which undermines team's performance. So here is another screenshot from also the real session. It happened at PandaDoc about 2 years ago, when we approached the point when we already had, if I'm not mistaken, 12 teams working on the same product backlog, and making it quite challenging for the product owner to take care of all that cognitive load they had to keep in their minds. So we back then came up with the decision to split the organization into tracks, which I've already mentioned before, and how we approach it. So first of all, we thought about how we should define those tracks, and we ended up with focusing each track on a different kind of the ideal customer profile, as we call it ICP, or you can consider it a user persona. So different kind of customers or personas which are using our product. We've defined a clear set of metrics and goals which each of those personas are trying to solve by using our product, and we also defined some set of business metrics which how we can measure the impact of those personas on our company's performance. We then decided who would be the leading product person for each of those tracks. And then we decided how many teams we want to have in each track. And this is basically how we want to diversify the investments we make as a company. And we've conducted the self-design workshop, where each product leader presented or pitched the purpose of their track, what they will be working on, what it actually means from the daily work perspective, and the self-design happens. So first of all, people just chosen which track they want to go to, then they form the teams. This is another, by the way, set of photos from the recent LESS conference, which happened in Warsaw. These are 2 agile coaches from the company called Avast, which some of you might know. It's developing quite a good software for security of your personal laptop or of like company infrastructure. And this is the photos of the real Miro boards they used to conduct self-design in their company. So they went through the same steps, and you can see on the left here that they had they asked people to come up with their avatars, to do some kind of color coding of their expertise tech stack. They've created those spaces for each team, team that will happen. And they went through several rounds, ending up with having 11 teams self-designed and the new structure defined. And by the way, if you think this is something new, like some very new idea, it's not. Here, for example, you can see the screenshot from the first issue of the Administrative Science Quarterly magazine from 1976, where they are describing the experience of self-designing the organization in one of the company based in the United States, and also the reasoning for that. If you want to discover more real-life examples, and once again, my talk is about self-design, not about LESS, but volunteering and self-design are important parts of LESS. So you can check out the page with case studies of the LESS community, and there you will find quite some descriptions of the way people conducted self-design, how it went, and what challenges they faced. And of course, photos of real people doing that in a real offline setup back when it was still normal life. I shall quickly run through the benefits and side effects, because I see that we are quickly running out of time. So let me first focus on my observations. When it comes to Daniel Pink's model, ability to choose whom to work with positively affects sets of autonomy. Ability to choose which goal to pursue positively affects both purpose and mastery, resulting in that drive, which Daniel Pink highlights as the important part of motivation for a creative work. Usually self-design teams have much stronger sense of ownership, better engagement, and they much more focus on outcomes over outputs. So on delivering value than on like counting the amount of story points they've delivered in the sprint, or counting number of tickets they delivered. And members of self-design teams are more likely to learn multiple specializations. When it comes to facts from the industry and why this is important, so first of all, from the retention perspective, 83% of employees, according to different studies, are always looking for some new challenges to take. But if they're highly engaged, they're more likely to stay in the organization. At the same time, 56% of people not engaged and 73% of actively disengaged employees are much more likely to accept offers from another company. And when it comes to the US market, losing an employee can cost an average from $15,000 to $25,000 for a company to prepare the replacement, because they lose some investment they've spent on training those people and hiring those people, and they will also lose some money on hiring new person instead, like getting them trained and make them perform. Also, disengaged employees cost organizations between $450 and $550 billion annually, and this is only in the US market, not globally. High engagement, high retention companies are 40% more productive than the average company. And if you have a proper product management place, imagine how much more value and how much more revenue you can get out of those additional 40% of productivity. And highly engaged business units realize a 41% reduction in absenteeism and 70% increase in productivity. But software and product software development is not only about engagement, it's also about the quality and value, right? So here are the last data on that, coming mostly from Gallup and Forbes. So highly engaged organizations saw 40% fewer quality defects. Engaged employees are 17% more productive than their peers, and highly engaged organizations have 21% higher profitability than their peers. Why I'm bringing up this data here, and by the way, you will have access to these slides afterwards, is because I believe that if in a certain point of time you try to introduce self-design in your organization and you face some resistance from the management, you can always refer to these facts from the industry in order to make them at least consider that option and change their mind. So yeah, luckily we still have some time for questions, and yeah, thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Denis. Are there any questions open? Any feedback, input? Also very welcome the remote people to ask questions if there are any questions open.
So in your second point, you were talking about constraints and guidelines. And if I got it correct, you were mentioning constraining the team size such that and also like the skill sets such that component teams don't form. If you're talking about self-design, I didn't get why you would actually need these constraints. Isn't it that the people in the room trying to self-design the thing that they then need to solve with the team structure should be able to decide in all these dimensions and whatever?
Yeah, so it's quite a good point. And why I believe that putting those constraints is important is because basically when we talk about teams or people in the teams having complete freedom to choose what they do and like what teams they form, I think that we're already stepping into the domain of self-governing teams, because like the management of the company are the people who are responsible for the success of the company, and that's why they're there to decide the overall direction of the company. And like when you have the overall direction specified, so you know that, for example, as a company, you want to develop a documents management product, not like, for example, building electric vehicles. This already puts some constraints on like what kind of expertise you will need in the company and what kind of expertise you will need in the teams. So this is why I believe that those constraints should be there in order to avoid like shifting that self-design exercise into a complete chaos and anarchy.
There is another question just in the chat. Maybe Denis, you can cover this one as well.
Yeah. So hi, and thank you for your presentation. What would you try in an organization where you also have support requirements in those teams? What would be your first steps? Hint, nobody wants to do support. That's an interesting question and very deep one. So it's difficult to give some very like silver bullet kind of answer, but I will try. So I mean, what I would probably try to focus on is to understand like what is the ratio of that support work which currently exists in the product, and what's the nature of this. So where it's coming from, where it is coming from like some issues with the quality, if it's coming with some issues with like not matching the customer's expectations, etc. And probably that would navigate the constraints we would put on teams a lot, because usually even when you have self-design in place, you can still introduce some practices or ways to mitigate, like, for example, I don't know, shifting the responsibility for addressing the backlog of those support requirements, or like having some community of people willing to volunteer for that. Also, for example, if we land back on the PandaDoc example, what we do two things. And yeah, most of our teams are self-designed. First of all, we have this actually rotation of people on the duty in each track. So each sprint, different team, or each second sprint, different team is responsible for addressing the incoming requests. So therefore, we have it distributed more or less equally. And also, we have kind of service ownership policy, but this is not a service ownership in a way that like all changes in a certain service should go through specific people through code review, or that only these people can work on that component. It's more about the fact that if something goes wrong in production with that component, we know which team to reach out to and which team to try to address it. Well, I can't say that this is a perfect solution, but this is probably one of the solutions which could be made. So I would say that this question lies a little bit outside of the domain of self-design, but it's something that there are some practices which can help to address it in a self-designed way. You can also ask people, if you have enough sufficient level of volunteering in the organization, you can try to brainstorm together with people what kind of solutions you have for this issue.